Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into the smoky, candlelit corners of medieval taverns, where meals were as much about survival as they were about community. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, and let's drift together into a world where every bite carried a story and every drink had a purpose. When you think of a medieval tavern, you might imagine rowdy crowds, tankards slamming against wooden tables, and a general air of mischief hanging in the smoky haze, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. Taverns were lively places, often the heart of the village or town. They were where news spread, friendships formed, and the occasional brawl erupted when someone got a bit too enthusiastic with their mead. But let's start with the food. What exactly was on the menu in these ancient watering holes, and how did it reflect the times they lived in? First off, let's be clear, medieval tavern food was no fancy affair. Forget Instagram-worthy plates or Michelin-starred meals. The typical menu leaned heavily toward the practical, the filling, and the affordable. After all, most tavern-goers were farmers, labourers, or travellers, folks who needed something warm in their bellies without spending a king's ransom. A typical meal might start with something called pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables were in season, plus maybe a bit of grain like barley or oats. Sometimes, if you were lucky, a scrap or two of meat or bones simmered in the pot to add a bit of flavour. Imagine a pot bubbling away over a smoky hearth, a mix of cabbage, leeks, onions, maybe some turnips, all stirred together until there became a single hearty dish. Bread was the staple that anchored nearly every meal. But this wasn't the soft, fluffy loaf you might buy today. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and often made with coarse grains, rye, barley, or a mix of whatever was available. And it wasn't always the freshest either. Stale bread was common, but no one complained much. It filled the stomach, and that was what counted. Cheese too made frequent appearances. Hard cheeses that could last for weeks without spoiling were a tavern keeper's best friend. Soft cheeses were a luxury, reserved for wealthier tables or special occasions, and butter, when it was available, might be smeared on bread or added to pottage for a little extra richness. Of course, meat was a prize catch, literally and figuratively. Fresh meat wasn't always easy to come by, especially for the common folk. In taverns, meat often meant salted pork or preserved fish, something that could survive the unpredictable storage conditions of the Middle Ages. Salted herring, for instance, was a common sight, its briny scent filling the air alongside the smoke from the hearth. Eggs were a treat, usually from chickens that scratched around the village or a neighbour's farm. They weren't an everyday luxury, but when available, they'd be boiled, added to stews, or fried over the hearth. Imagine the sizzle of a small pan, the golden yolk bright against the darkness of a medieval kitchen. And then there were pies. Oh, the pies. Meat pies were a tavern staple and not always made with the most appetising cuts. Tough bits, offal, and whatever else couldn't be sold at the market often found their way into a flaky crust. Think of them as the medieval version of nose-to-tail eating. Nothing went to waste. But let's not forget the drink. Ale was the lifeblood of the tavern. Brewed in wooden barrels, it was dark, cloudy, and far from the crisp lagers you might sip today. This was liquid bread, thick with yeast, sometimes flavoured with herbs, and a staple for just about everyone. Water wasn't always safe to drink, so ale served as both hydration and relaxation. Wine, on the other hand, was a bit more upscale. Imported or made from local vineyards, it tended to be sour and heavy, often mixed with spices to mask any off flavours. Mulled wine, spiced with cinnamon, cloves, or even a dash of honey, was especially popular during colder months. Imagine the smell of warm wine laced with spices filling the air as the wind rattled the tavern walls. As we settle deeper into this night together, let's picture a typical evening inside one of these taverns. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, mingling with the tang of ale. Wooden benches crowd around rough-hewn tables, the candlelight flickering off pewter mugs and the occasional glint of a knife. The innkeeper, usually a sturdy figure with a ready smile or a sharp word depending on the mood, moves from table to table, offering refills and chatting with guests. He's the unofficial newsman of the village, carrying gossip from one end of town to the other. If you wanted to know who was marrying whom, who had a dispute over land, or whether the harvest was good this year, you asked the innkeeper. Patrons huddled together, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes sullen silence. A travelling merchant might regale a crowd with tales of distant lands, his cloak still dusted from the road. A farmhand might sit quietly, nursing his ale after a long day in the fields, and in the corner, a bard might strum a lute or recite a poem, his voice weaving through the chatter like a gentle thread. Meals weren't served on plates so much as on thick wooden boards or in small earthen bowls. Knives were shared, and spoons were sometimes communal. If you wanted to eat with your fingers, no one raised an eyebrow. Hygiene wasn't exactly top of mind. Washing hands before meals was a suggestion at best, and soap was a luxury few could afford. You can almost hear the clatter of cups, the low murmur of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter that cuts through the night. The fire crackles in the hearth, its light dancing on the walls, throwing shifting shadows that make the tavern feel both cosy and mysterious all at once. Imagine the menu changing with the seasons. In summer, fresh herbs might brighten the stews, and berries might appear in simple tarts. In winter, meals turned heartier, thicker pottages, salt meat, and root vegetables that could last through the cold months. The tavern kitchen was a place of constant improvisation. If a farmer dropped by with a few extra eggs or a rabbit, that night's stew might have a surprise twist. The cook, often the innkeeper's wife or a hired hand, worked tirelessly in the back, stirring pots, chopping vegetables, and keeping an eye on the fire. There were no timers or precise recipes, just experience, intuition, and the occasional taste test with a wooden spoon. And in the thick of winter, with the wind howling and the cold seeping in through every crack, that stew pot became a lifeline. Let's pause a moment to appreciate just how central food was to the life of a medieval tavern. It wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about creating a space where people could come together, share news, settle disputes, and feel a little less alone in a harsh world. A warm meal and a mug of ale could ease the troubles of a long day in the fields or on the road. And it wasn't always about survival. Sometimes food was about celebration. A feast day, a wedding, a successful harvest. These were reasons to cook up something special. A whole roasted pig, perhaps, or a rare treat like a honey cake or spiced wine. The air would fill with the sounds of singing, laughter, and maybe a fiddle playing a merry tune. It was in those moments that the tavern transformed from a simple eatery into the beating heart of the community. But even on the quietest nights, when the fire was low and the crowd had thinned, the tavern remained a place of refuge. A weary traveller could find a meal, a place to sit, and maybe a bed upstairs if he was lucky. And in a world without streetlights or safe roads, that meant more than just comfort. It meant survival. As you drift deeper into this medieval night with me, think of the simple pleasures these taverns offered. A bowl of pottage steaming in the candlelight, a chunk of dark bread still warm from the hearth, the steady clink of mugs raised in toasts, and the gentle hum of voices sharing the burdens and joys of life. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters. Maybe a dog howls in the distance, or the faint sound of a church bell marks the hour. But inside there's warmth, laughter, and the smell of food that, for tonight at least, keeps the cold and the darkness at bay. We're just getting started on this journey. There's so much more to explore. The recipes that survived the centuries, the clever tricks medieval cooks used to stretch a meal, and the unexpected surprises that might appear in the bottom of a pot. So stay with me. Let the sound of the hearth and the murmur of the tavern carry you deeper into this world, and when you're ready, we'll continue our walk through the bustling, aromatic, and sometimes questionable delights of medieval tavern food. Because in these dark, smoky corners of history, every meal tells a story, and every story brings us a little closer to the people who came before us. Welcome back, traveller. Let's continue our journey through the flickering candlelight of medieval taverns, where the scents of roasting meats and freshly baked bread mingle with the chatter of patrons. Let's step a little deeper into this world where every meal was a patchwork of necessity, creativity, and, sometimes, a touch of mystery. We've already talked about pottage and bread, but let's talk about something that could make, or break, any meal: spices. Now, before you imagine medieval peasants sprinkling saffron or cinnamon with carefree abandon, let's set the record straight. Spices were precious commodities, carried over long trade routes that stretched from the east to the ports of England. A pinch of pepper might have been worth its weight in silver, and saffron was so valuable it was sometimes locked away like a treasure. For the average tavern, spices were rare but not completely unheard of. A good innkeeper might stretch a small stash of black pepper, or if especially lucky, a bit of ginger or cloves. These treasures added not just flavour but a touch of status to a dish. A pottage laced with a hint of pepper. That was a meal worth remembering. Most of the time, though, the flavours were simpler, drawn from the land and the seasons. Fresh herbs, sage, thyme, rosemary, grew in kitchen gardens and were tossed into stews and pies to brighten the taste. Garlic and onions were everyday workhorses, adding depth to whatever simmered in the pot, and sometimes a splash of vinegar or a bit of sour ale gave a dish a tangy bite that cut through the richness. Salt, of course, was essential, not just for flavour but for survival. It preserved meat and fish, kept vegetables from spoiling, and even found its way into bread recipes. A tavern without salt was a tavern in trouble. Imagine a kitchen where every ingredient had to last through cold winters and unpredictable harvests. Salt was the quiet hero, the silent guardian against the creeping touch of spoilage. And let's not forget honey. When sugar was a distant luxury, honey was the sweetener of choice. Drizzled over porridge, stirred into ale, or baked into a simple cake, honey added a golden warmth that turned even the plainest meal into a small feast. Bees were prized in every village, their hives carefully tended, their honey harvested like liquid gold. Now, picture yourself at a wooden table, the flickering candle casting long shadows on the rough walls. The innkeeper's wife arrives with a bowl of something steaming. A pottage tonight, thick and hearty, with chunks of root vegetables and maybe a few strips of salted pork. She sets it down with a small smile and you catch the scent of rosemary and garlic. It's simple, but it's nourishing. A small comfort against the cold wind outside. As you eat, you might glance around at the other patrons. A group of merchants, their boots dusty from the road, sharing a jug of ale and talking about the latest trade routes. A local farmer, his face weathered from the sun, staring into his mug, lost in thought. Maybe a young couple, laughing quietly over a shared piece of bread, their hands brushing as they reach for the same cup. These are the quiet moments that filled medieval taverns, a tapestry of lives woven together by food, drink, and the shared need for warmth. Now let's turn our attention to some of the more interesting ingredients that sometimes found their way into the medieval kitchen. Offal, for instance. The parts of the animal that today might make you pause. Liver, kidneys, heart, and even brains. Nothing went to waste. These bits were simmered into stews, baked into pies, or fried over the hearth. They might not have been everyone's favourite, but they were protein, and in a world where meat was scarce, they were prized. Then there were eels. Yes, eels. In some places, eels were a common catch, especially in rivers and marshes. They were skinned, cooked, and served in stews or pies. Imagine the glistening, slightly oily meat, the smell of the river still clinging to it. Not the most glamorous dish, perhaps, but it filled the belly and gave strength for the next day's labour. Fish too made regular appearances, especially on Fridays and during Lent, when the church's rules forbade meat. Salted herring, pickled fish, or even dried stockfish might arrive on the tavern table, sometimes with a sauce of vinegar and mustard to mask the strong flavours. For a touch of luxury, a tavern might offer a dish of roast fowl, chicken, goose, or even pigeon. These meals were usually reserved for feast days or wealthy travellers who could afford a little extra. Picture a simple wooden platter, a roasted bird resting on a bed of herbs, its skin glistening from the hearth's heat. The smell alone would draw envious eyes from every table. Sometimes special occasions called for a real showpiece, a pie baked with a surprise inside, maybe a small bird that would fly out when the crust was cut, or a handful of spices that would fill the air with a sudden exotic fragrance. It was a rare treat, a bit of medieval dinner theatre that delighted guests and reminded them of the tavern's place as both a kitchen and a stage. But meals weren't just about the food itself, they were about the experience. The wooden mugs passed from hand to hand, the sound of ale sloshing as a friend refilled your cup, the occasional bark of laughter as someone shared a joke that might have been funny, or might have been at someone's expense. The creak of the door as another traveller entered, bringing a rush of cold air and the smell of wet cloaks. The innkeeper's children might run between tables carrying bread or collecting empty bowls. A dog might curl up by the hearth, hoping for a scrap. And above it all, the steady rhythm of life, one meal at a time, one story at a time, played out in the glow of the tavern's fire. Imagine too the simple act of sharing a table with strangers. In a time when most people lived in small villages or on isolated farms, the tavern was a crossroads, a place where stories, gossip and news spread faster than any written word. A travelling merchant might bring tales of distant lands, spices that smelled of faraway markets, or fabrics that shimmered with foreign dyes. A soldier might share stories of battles fought in lands most had never seen, his armour battered and his eyes weary. A monk might stop for a meal, his robe dusty from the road, offering quiet blessings in exchange for a bowl of stew. Every meal was a lesson in community, in the fragile threads that bound people together, and while the food itself might not have been fancy, it was the heart of these connections. A shared loaf of bread could bridge the gap between strangers. A warm bowl of pottage could ease a weary heart. In a world of uncertainty, plague, famine, war, the tavern meal was a small island of comfort. Let's pause again to think about the kitchen itself, the heart of the tavern, a place of smoke and embers, where iron pots swung over open fires and knives gleamed in the candlelight. The cook, sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot that never seemed to stop boiling. The smell of onions and garlic mingling with the scent of burning wood. A simple place, but also a place of quiet magic, where humble ingredients became something more. In the corner, a small sack of flour waits to be turned into flatbreads, a crock of lard ready to be used for frying, a handful of herbs drying by the fire. Each element a piece of a larger puzzle, each meal a reflection of the land, the season, and the people who gathered there. As you listen, let the warmth of that kitchen fire fill your imagination, the sound of the ladle scraping the bottom of the pot, the hiss of fat as it hits a hot pan, the quiet murmur of voices from the common room, the clink of mugs and the soft shuffle of feet on the wooden floor. Tonight, we're just beginning to unravel the rich tapestry of medieval tavern life. There's so much more to explore, the drinks that lifted spirits, the bread that held communities together, and the unexpected flavours that brought both comfort and surprise to even the simplest meal. So, settle in, take another sip of your warm drink, and let's continue this journey together. Because in the shadows of these ancient walls, in the glow of the hearth fire, there are still stories to be told and meals to be shared, one quiet evening at a time. Beyond the bustling kitchen, the tavern cellar was an unsung hero in keeping patrons satisfied. Often dug into the cool earth beneath the building, it was the place where barrels of ale, casks of wine, and preserved foods were stored away from the heat of the hearth. The air down there was damp and smelled faintly of wood, earth, and the tang of fermenting drink. It was in these cellars that the lifeblood of the tavern, the drink, was nurtured and protected. Ale wasn't just a drink, it was a daily staple. Brewed on site or sourced from local brewers, it varied from dark and bitter to lighter and slightly sour, depending on the region and the season. Some batches were thick enough to chew, others thin and a bit watery, but all were a safer bet than the local water supply. A barrel might last a week or more if the tavern was busy, with the innkeeper carefully tapping the fresh brew, watching the foam rise and hoping the batch hadn't gone sour overnight. Wine, though less common, had its own place in the tavern's lineup. Often imported, its journey from vineyard to goblet was long and uncertain. A cask of wine might have spent weeks on a creaking wagon or months in the hold of a ship jostled by waves and weather. By the time it reached the tavern, it could be sharp and acidic, a far cry from the velvety wines of the modern world. Tavern keepers sometimes added spices, honey, or even a splash of brandy to mask the harshness. And on cold nights, mulled wine, a warm mixture of wine, sugar and spices, brought comfort like no other. Outside the cellar, near the hearth or hanging from the beams, bunches of herbs dried in the smoky air, bundles of sage, thyme and marjoram, ready to be crumbled into stews or pressed into sausages. These herbs weren't just for flavour, they helped preserve meat, fend off insects, and in some cases were believed to chase away evil spirits. A pinch of rosemary or a sprig of mint was as much a charm as a seasoning. The tavern's kitchen also played host to other forms of preservation. Meats were salted, dried or smoked in small brick smokehouses at the back of the building. Rows of fish hung on wooden racks, their skin glistening and their smell sharp enough to wrinkle even the most seasoned nose. Hams and sides of bacon, cured and hung from the rafters, were prized for their ability to last through lean seasons. A slice of smoked pork, crisped over the fire, was a welcome addition to any meal, a small luxury in a life often short on comfort. Cheese-making, too, found a home in the tavern's daily rhythm. Wheels of cheese, some the size of small barrels aged in cool corners. The flavours varied, from sharp and crumbly to soft and pungent, depending on the milk, the herbs used, and the length of time they'd spent aging. A wedge of cheese with a hunk of bread made a meal in itself, simple yet sustaining. As the evening deepened and shadows lengthened in the tavern's corners, the focus often shifted from eating to storytelling. Patrons leaned in close, sharing tales of local legends, travellers' adventures, and the occasional ghost story that made even the bravest shiver. The flickering candlelight lent a conspiratorial glow to these exchanges. It wasn't unusual for a storyteller to punctuate his tale with a dramatic pause, a long sip of ale, and a glance around the room to make sure every ear was listening. At times, a travelling minstrel or a local bard might set up near the hearth, plucking a lute or playing a simple tune on a flute. The music floated through the smoky air, mingling with the clink of mugs and the murmur of voices. Some tunes were lively, drawing a few to tap their feet or even dance a little jig between the tables. Others were slow and haunting, carrying tales of lost loves, fallen knights, and distant lands. Music was more than entertainment. It was a balm for the soul, a shared moment that bound everyone together. Underneath the laughter and song, though, was a constant awareness of the hardships beyond the tavern walls. Bad harvests, high taxes, rumours of war, these weighed heavily on every mind. But in the warm glow of the tavern, those troubles felt a little smaller, if only for an hour or two. The tavern was a refuge, a place to put down the burdens of the world, even if just for the length of a meal or a song. Outside, the world might be cloaked in darkness and mist, the roads empty save for the occasional traveller hurrying to reach shelter before the night grew too cold. Inside, the fire cracked and spat embers into the air, casting a glow on the faces of those who'd found their way here. A tired farmer, a wandering friar, a merchant with tales of cities far to the south. They all shared the same space, the same warmth. The tavern was more than a place to eat. It was a lifeline in a world where isolation could be deadly. On nights when the wind howled and the cold crept in through the cracks, the closeness of others, the shared laughter, the hum of conversation was as vital as any meal. To break bread with someone was to say, "You're not alone in this world," and that bread, coarse and dark, baked in the tavern's own hearth or delivered by a local baker, was the staff of life. Sometimes, in times of scarcity, it might be stretched with ground beans or even sawdust, a desperate measure that turned every bite into an act of survival. Other times, when the harvest was good and the fields had yielded their bounty, it was dense and nutty, warm from the oven and spread with a bit of butter or honey if you were lucky. Ale, too, was a constant companion. The tavern's brew might vary from barrel to barrel, a living drink that changed with the yeast, the grain, and the mood of the brewer. Sometimes it was young and sharp, other times mellowed by time and warmth. It wasn't just a drink, it was a source of calories, a safer option than the uncertain water, and a comfort that took the edge off a long day's labour. Occasionally a cask of stronger drink, mead or even imported spirits, might appear behind the bar. Mead, sweet and golden, carried the taste of honey and wildflowers. A sip of it on a cold night was like sunshine in a cup. Stronger spirits were rarer and more expensive, but prized by those who could afford the luxury. A small glass of fiery brandy could warm even the most frozen bones. The cook, a figure of quiet authority in the kitchen, moved among pots and pans, stirring, tasting, adding a pinch of this or a splash of that. Their hands were calloused from years of chopping and lifting heavy pots. Recipes weren't written down, they lived in memory, passed from mother to daughter, from cook to apprentice. A dash of sage for the stew, a handful of barley for the pot. Every dish was a story, a testament to survival and ingenuity. Even the humblest dish carried the weight of history. A piece of salted fish might have come from a barrel packed months earlier, layered in salt and pressed tight to keep the rot at bay. A wedge of cheese might have been shaped from milk drawn in the spring, aged through the summer, and now in the heart of winter was a small reminder of warmer days. The tavern itself creaked and groaned as the night wore on, the old timbers settling, the wind testing the shutters. The smell of smoke and spiced wine clung to every surface, a reminder of the countless nights like this one that had come before. Candles burned low, their light dancing on the walls, chasing away the shadows that gathered in the corners. Some patrons lingered over their drinks, reluctant to step back into the cold night. Others had already left, their footsteps fading down the darkened road. But in the kitchen, the cook banked the fire, ensuring embers would still glow come morning. The last of the stew simmered in its pot, and the innkeeper checked the barrels, making sure tomorrow's drink would be ready. Outside, the world slept fitfully, dreams tangled with the sound of the wind and the promise of another dawn. Inside, the tavern stood as it always had, a beacon in the dark, a place where stories and meals intertwined, where laughter found its voice, and where even the hardest day could end with the comfort of a warm meal and a friendly face. Sometimes the tavern itself became a stage for small dramas of everyday life. A travelling merchant might argue with a local farmer over the price of grain, their voices low but tense. A group of young men might laugh too loudly, their heads close together as they planned a journey or a prank. The smell of ale on their breath. A woman might slip into a shadowed corner, sharing quiet words with a friend or a lover, a secret exchange in the hush of a crowded room. These moments wove themselves into the tavern's story as surely as the scent of roasting meat or the glow of the hearth. In the kitchen, the cook's work never truly ended. Even as the night stretched on, a new loaf of bread might be set to rise, or a pot of bones and scraps might simmer slowly, becoming the base for tomorrow's stew. Every meal was built on the memory of the last, a living cycle that tied each day to the one before. Leftovers found new life in pies or pottages, every scrap too valuable to waste. Bones flavoured broths, peels became feed for pigs, even ashes from the hearth could be saved to make life a soap. Waste was a luxury no one could afford. Along the tavern's beams, dried herbs swayed gently with each draught, their scent subtle but comforting. They weren't just for flavour though. Some herbs were thought to carry protective qualities. A sprig of rosemary tucked into a doorframe might ward off illness. A clutch of sage might bring good fortune. These little acts of faith lingered in every corner, reminders that in a world without modern medicine, every small comfort mattered. Nearby, a sack of grain leaned against the wall, destined to be ground into flour or added to the ale mash. Grain was a constant presence in the medieval diet, the foundation of bread, porridge and drink alike. Sometimes it came from the tavern's own fields, other times it arrived in trade brought by a farmer with a weary mule. The quality varied, depending on the harvest, the weather, the whims of fate. A good year meant loaves that rose high and full. A bad year meant thin, flat cakes that filled the stomach but not the spirit. The cook's hands bore the marks of their craft. Burns from the fire, small scars from knives dulled by years of chopping. Each mark told a story. A burn from a boiling pot on a market day. A cut from a hasty slice when the tavern was too busy to breathe. These hands were part of the tavern's history, as essential as the old beams or the worn wooden floor. Over at the bar, the innkeeper polished mugs with a rag that had seen better days. His eyes roamed the room, watching, assessing, remembering. He knew every patron by face, most by name, and could sense trouble before it started. A group of travellers lingering too long over a single drink. They might be short on coin. A local farmer drinking faster than usual. Maybe a bad harvest weighed on his mind. The innkeeper's job was part host, part peacekeeper, part confessor. He kept the ale flowing and the peace steady, his presence as calming as the steady light of the hearth. Some nights, a local healer or wise woman might sit by the fire, sharing advice with those who came seeking help. Remedies for coughs, salves for burns, small charms for protection. Her knowledge was woven from old tales, from lessons learned from mothers and grandmothers, from experiments that worked and those that didn't. She might barter her remedies for a warm meal, or a piece of cheese, or a promise of help come harvest. Her place in the tavern was as welcome as the cook's, her wisdom a balm in a world where illness lurked in every shadow. Children sometimes darted among the tables quick as sparrows, carrying bread or scraps of meat. Their laughter was a bright note in the tavern's hum, a reminder that life continued even in the darkest seasons. They knew the corners where the floor creaked, the safe spots to hide when tempers flared. Their games, simple, rough, but full of joy, were the heart of the tavern's future, a promise that the old beams would shelter new generations. Near the hearth, a dog might doze, one ear twitching at the sound of a falling crumb. He'd earned his place with loyalty and the occasional chase after a wayward rat. No one minded his presence. In fact, many found comfort in his steady breathing, the warmth he shared without asking. His eyes followed the cook's movements, knowing that sooner or later, a bone or a scrap of fat would come his way. Outside, the wind might pick up, rattling the shutters and sending a shiver through the room. A traveller's cloak hung near the fire to dry, swayed slightly as the draught found its way in. The flickering candlelight danced with the shadows, painting stories on the walls, some true, some imagined, all part of the tavern's long memory. In the background, the rhythmic sound of a knife chopping vegetables blended with the murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of a mug. A pot simmered on the hearth, its contents bubbling slowly, promising tomorrow's meal. The air smelled of wood smoke, of roasting meat, of bread and herbs. It was the smell of sustenance, of comfort, of a place where people found what they needed to face another day. Some nights, talk turned to the wider world, the rumours of war, of taxes rising, of a noble's quarrel spilling into the countryside. These conversations carried a quiet urgency, a sense that even here, in this small haven, the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. But for tonight, the hearth burned bright, the mugs were full, and the stew was thick and hot. For tonight, the tavern was enough. As the night wore on, the tavern's rhythm slowed. Voices dropped to low murmurs, laughter softened. A man at the far table leaned back, his eyes half closed, a small smile playing on his lips as he listened to the gentle strum of a lute. The innkeeper wiped down the bar, his movements slow, his eyes thoughtful. The cook in the kitchen checked the banked fire, made sure the embers would last till morning. And so the tavern settled into its quiet hours, the hush before dawn when the world paused to breathe. Outside, the stars burned cold and bright, ancient and unchanging. Inside, the tavern glowed with a softer light, the glow of a place that had seen laughter and tears, triumph and heartbreak, meals shared and stories told. Here, in the heart of the night, the tavern held its secrets close, waiting for the morning when the world would stir again, and the cycle would begin anew, bread rising, ale pouring, knives chopping, and voices blending in the timeless song of survival and community. As the first hints of dawn crept into the sky, the tavern remained hushed, a place caught between sleep and waking. The embers in the hearth glowed softly, casting a warm orange light across the worn floorboards and rough-hewn beams. Shadows shifted gently with each crackle of the fire, painting stories of countless nights before. In the kitchen, the cook moved quietly, their hands practiced in the rhythm of the morning. A pot of porridge simmered on the hearth, its gentle bubbling a promise of the day's first meal. Oats or barley, thickened with a splash of milk if fortune allowed, sweetened perhaps with a drizzle of honey on good days. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, a way to brace the body against the chill of the morning. Bread, too, was always at the heart of the tavern's morning fare. A few loaves, baked the day before, rested on the table, dense and dark, their crusts marked by the heat of the oven. The cook sliced them carefully, each piece an offering of comfort. Sometimes, if the market had been kind, there might be a smear of butter or a slice of cheese to go alongside. Even a simple wedge of onion could brighten a meagre meal. The smell of brewing ale began to rise from the barrels. Fresh batches, carefully tended by the innkeeper, awaited the day's visitors. A thin, foamy head might appear, carrying the sharp tang of yeast and grain. It wasn't a luxury, but it was honest. Each mug a small reward for labour, a companion to the meals that sustained every soul who entered the tavern's door. As the sun edged higher, a few early risers shuffled in, travellers who had slept in a corner, heads resting on rough tables, local farmers heading out to their fields, perhaps a tradesman preparing for a long day of work. Their faces were lined with sleep, their hands already calloused with the marks of the day's burdens. Yet here, for a moment, they found warmth, a place to gather themselves before stepping back into the demands of life. The innkeeper moved among them, his hands steady, his eyes calm. He offered bread and porridge, a small smile, a brief word of comfort. In this place, even the most worn-out traveller could find a pause, a breath, a reminder that community existed in the smallest of gestures. Beyond the door, the day beckoned. Carts creaked on the road, carrying goods to market. Chickens called out their morning greetings from nearby yards. A dog barked in the distance, its voice sharp and clear. Yet within the tavern, time felt different. A place where the weight of the world could be set down, if only for a few minutes. Mid-morning brought more visitors, families seeking a warm meal after chores, merchants pausing to rest their feet and share news from the road. The tavern filled with the low hum of voices, the quiet clink of mugs, the occasional burst of laughter. The cook worked steadily, ladling out bowls of stew left from the night before, adding scraps of meat and vegetables to stretch each serving as far as it could go. Near the hearth, a small pot of broth simmered, its scent mingled with the tang of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of dried herbs. A handful of wild garlic might find its way in, or a sprig of thyme plucked from the bunches that hung overhead. Each addition a small kindness, a way to make the simple meal a little more comforting. The walls of the tavern held the memories of these meals, echoes of laughter, of arguments settled over mugs of ale, of travellers sharing stories that carried the scent of distant lands. The marks of generations lay hidden in every creak of the floorboards, every scratch on the wooden tables. Each cup and plate bore the fingerprints of countless hands, each meal a thread in the tapestry of life that had unfolded here. Sometimes the talk would turn to more than food. A local woman might mention a neighbour's new calf, a sign of hope after a hard winter. A merchant might share news of a distant town, the price of grain, the rumour of conflict. The innkeeper listened, nodding, storing each detail in the quiet vault of his mind. The tavern was a place of nourishment, but also a place of knowledge, of the small connections that held the community together. Outside, the world continued its rhythm. Fields stretched toward the horizon, the land greening with the promise of harvest. In the distance, the faint outline of a castle loomed, a reminder of the lords who ruled these lands. Yet here, in the tavern's embrace, those worries felt a little less sharp. Here, there was a meal waiting, a smile shared, a place to sit and rest. The cook wiped their hands on a worn cloth, their eyes scanning the room. A young mother cradled her child in a quiet corner, her face weary but calm. An old man sat near the door, his eyes half closed, a mug of ale warming his hands. A small group of travellers whispered together, the map between them marked with the lines of the road ahead. Each one had come seeking something, a meal, a moment of rest, a sliver of hope. And the tavern, in its simple, steadfast way, offered it freely. A bowl of porridge, a hunk of bread, a place by the fire. It wasn't much, but sometimes in a world that could be harsh and uncertain, it was everything. And so the day wore on, the light shifting across the room as the sun climbed and fell. The tavern's hum continued, a rhythm of voices, of footsteps, of the small sounds that marked a day well lived. Outside, the road stretched on, carrying travellers toward unknown destinations. But inside, the tavern remained, a constant, a quiet refuge, a place where food and fellowship met to sustain the spirit as well as the body. Here, in this place of wood and stone, of hearth and table, life unfolded one meal at a time, and in that unfolding, in every loaf of bread, every bowl of stew, every sip of ale, was a reminder that even in the hardest times, community mattered. That sharing a meal was more than just sustenance. It was an act of hope, an act of resilience, a promise that tomorrow would come, and with it, the chance to gather once more. As the day turned toward evening, the tavern took on a different kind of energy. The air grew richer with the sense of dinner, a thick stew perhaps, or a pot of beans cooked with a few scraps of meat and seasoned with whatever herbs the cook had on hand. A crusty loaf might emerge from the hearth, its edges charred just so, ready to be torn and shared. Patrons began to trickle in, drawn by the promise of warmth and the familiar hum of voices. Farmers, their clothes still marked with the dust of the fields, found a seat near the hearth, stretching out weary legs. A merchant might choose a spot by the window, a small candle casting a circle of light on a worn ledger. A traveller, face hidden beneath a hood, might pause at the door, weighing the welcome within against the darkness outside. The innkeeper, ever watchful, moved quietly between tables, offering a nod here, a word of greeting there. He knew the regulars by name, knew their stories. The widow whose son had gone to fight in the king's army, the old soldier whose leg ached every time the wind shifted, the young couple who saved every coin for a plot of land of their own, each one a thread in the fabric of this place. At the bar, mugs were filled with the tavern's ale, cloudy but hearty, its foam rising in uneven peaks. Ale was more than a drink here. It was a companion, a comfort, a bridge between people who might otherwise pass each other in silence. Every sip carried with it the taste of barley and thyme, of hard work and small celebrations. The cook's hands moved deftly as the night deepened. A pot of pottage simmered slowly, its contents a mix of root vegetables, a few slices of meat, and a handful of dried herbs. The aroma mingled with the sharper scent of wood smoke and the earthy tang of spilled ale. Now and then the cook would lean over the pot, tasting, testing, adjusting, a pinch of salt, a sprig of thyme, until the flavours felt just right. Near the door, a group of labourers played a quiet game of dice. Their laughter, low and warm, rippled through the tavern like a comforting tune. A few coins clinked on the table, wages hard-earned and spent carefully, each coin a testament to the day's labour. They shared bites of bread between rolls, dipped into the stew with wooden spoons that had known countless meals before. On some nights, a local fiddler might appear, his case worn from travel, his smile as quick as his bow. He'd set up near the hearth, drawing out tunes that slipped through the tavern like smoke. The music carried memories of harvest festivals, of dances in the village square, of times when the world felt lighter. Even those too tired to dance would tap a foot in time, their eyes bright with a brief, welcome spark. In one corner, a young woman leaned close to a friend, their voices hushed in a conversation only they could share. Between them, a half-empty mug sat forgotten. Their heads bent together, their hands gesturing softly, they wove stories of love and loss, of plans and dreams that reached beyond the walls of the tavern. Near the hearth, a dog stretched out on the floor, his coat dusty but warm. He lifted his head now and then to sniff the air, his tail thumping lazily when someone dropped a crust. His presence was a comfort, a reminder of loyalty that asked for nothing but a place to rest and the occasional scrap of meat. Above it all, the tavern itself seemed to breathe, a living place shaped by the people within its walls. The beams overhead bore the marks of old repairs, the tables bore the scars of countless meals, the air carried the memories of stories told and retold. Every sound, the creak of a chair, the murmur of voices, the sigh of the wind at the door, was part of the tavern's quiet song. In the kitchen, the last loaves of bread for the night were set aside to cool, their crusts dark, their shapes irregular. They were a small triumph of patience and skill. Bread was more than food here. It was a symbol of continuity, of the cook's steady hands and the innkeeper's quiet care. As the night deepened, the room settled into a comfortable hush. Mugs were refilled less often now, and voices grew lower. A tired mother rocked her child to sleep near the fire, her eyes half closed. A man dozed at his table, his head resting on folded arms, the remains of his meal still warm on his plate. The cook banked the hearth carefully, ensuring that enough embers would remain to rekindle the fire at dawn. The scent of the dying fire mingled with the lingering aroma of stew and ale, creating a perfume that only a tavern could wear. A scent of life lived fully, of days spent in work and nights spent in the company of others. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it the secrets of the night. The moon rose slowly, casting a pale light on the road that led away from the tavern, a road that would carry travellers on their journeys, farmers back to their fields, merchants to distant markets. But for now, in this place of wood and stone, of laughter and quiet conversations, time seemed to pause. Here, the worries of the world felt smaller. Here, a bowl of stew, a loaf of bread and a cup of ale were more than enough. Here, the warmth of the hearth and the company of others were the truest measure of wealth. And as the last candles guttered low and the tavern drifted towards sleep, there was a quiet comfort in knowing that tomorrow the fire would be lit again, the bread would rise, and the tavern's doors would open once more to welcome all who came seeking its gentle refuge. As the tavern settled into its midnight hush, the air felt heavy with stories yet to be told. Shadows stretched long across the worn wooden floor, each one carrying a memory of laughter, argument, or quiet reflection. The fire in the hearth, though banked and low, still glowed like a stubborn promise in the dark. Somewhere in the room, a lone traveller shifted on his bench, drawing his cloak tighter against the chill. His face half hidden in the shadow, he watched the last embers flicker, his thoughts drifting to roads yet to travel and meals yet to share. The cook's last duties were nearly done. Pots scrubbed, knives hung, and bread for the morrow set carefully to cool. Her hands, rough and steady, bore the marks of a life built on service and quiet endurance. The innkeeper, his voice low, checked on the last few patrons. A question here, a soft word there, each exchange a thread in the tapestry of the tavern's life. He paused by the hearth, adjusting a log, stirring the embers just enough to chase away the deepest shadows. The fire crackled softly in thanks, sending up a thin wisp of smoke that carried the scent of the night's meals, roast meat, thick stews, the sharp tang of ale. In a corner near the wall, a pair of old friends spoke in murmurs, their words blurred by the night's hush, but their faces etched with the lines of laughter and shared grief. Between them sat a single candle, its light gentle and unwavering. Now and then one would reach for a piece of bread, tearing it slowly, sharing it without words. The simple act of breaking bread, together a ritual older than the tavern itself. Near the kitchen door, a pot of broth simmered quietly, its surface barely rippling. The cook had left it there deliberately, a small kindness for the early risers, or the late wanderers who might seek a warm meal before the dawn. Even in the stillest hour, the tavern held the promise of comfort, a reminder that no one who entered its door need face the night's cold alone. The air carried the scent of herbs, thyme, rosemary, a hint of sage. Tied in small bundles near the hearth, they had given their flavours to the night's meals and now perfumed the tavern with memories of fields and gardens beyond its walls. Each bundle a small anchor to the world outside, a reminder that even in the hardest times nature provided. On the bar, the last mugs of ale sat mostly empty, their foam lacing the sides like the remnants of a once robust conversation. A few coins lay beside them, payment left by patrons who had slipped quietly into the night. The innkeeper noted each one, his mind as meticulous as his ledger, every coin accounted for, every story respected. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, carrying with it the sounds of the night, a distant dog barking, the low hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves. Travellers on the road might look to the tavern's glow as a beacon in the darkness, a promise that within its walls lay warmth, a meal, a place to rest weary feet. The road was long and the world often unkind, but here, for a few hours at least, the world could wait. Within the tavern, the night deepened. The air grew cooler, and the last patrons found their own places of rest. Heads bent on folded arms, cloaks drawn tight, dreams already pulling them toward dawn. The cook, her eyes heavy with sleep, closed the kitchen door softly. The last pot cleaned, the hearth tended. The innkeeper, his steps measured, moved from table to table, gathering empty mugs, smoothing the worn wooden surfaces, each gesture deliberate, a quiet devotion to the space that had sheltered so many lives. In that hush, the tavern itself seemed to exhale, a long, slow breath that carried with it the memory of the day's labours and laughter. The stories told and retold, the arguments settled and the plans made, the silent prayers offered up to any god who might listen, and the unspoken understanding that tomorrow the cycle would begin again. For in this place of simple meals and steady hearth fires, life found its own rhythm. Bread would be baked anew, stew would simmer, ale would be poured, and laughter would rise like the smoke from the hearth. Travellers would come and locals would linger, each seeking their own comfort, their own moment of belonging. And though the world outside might change, wars fought, kings crowned, seasons shifting within these walls, the tavern would remain. A refuge of bread and stew, of ale and firelight. A place where every meal was more than sustenance. It was a testament to the endurance of community, of shared burdens and shared joys. So, as the night wore on and the stars climbed higher in the sky, the tavern waited. Its doors closed, but never locked. Its hearth banked, but never cold. Ready, always, to welcome the weary, the hungry, the lost. For in a world that could be harsh and uncertain, the tavern offered the simplest of gifts: a meal, a bed, a light in the darkness. And in that simplicity, a promise that no one need face the night alone. As the first faint hints of dawn brushed the edges of the sky, the tavern stirred from its slumber. The coals in the hearth glowed dimly, their warmth a quiet reminder of the night's conversations and meals. Shadows stretched across the floorboards, growing softer as the darkness receded. The cook moved quietly through the kitchen, her steps sure even in the half-light. She lifted the lid of the small pot she'd left on the hearth the night before, the aroma of broth greeting her like an old friend. She stirred it gently, adding a handful of fresh herbs, thyme, maybe a bit of marjoram, her face thoughtful, eyes steady. The day's work would begin again soon, and there was comfort in the familiar. A few early risers drifted in. A farmer, shoulders stooped, hands rough from the field. He took his usual spot near the door, his eyes fixed on the mug before him. The innkeeper offered a nod, a small word of greeting, then moved on. No long conversations at this hour, just the quiet understanding that even the smallest exchange could ease the weight of a morning. The bread was ready, its crust dark and uneven, its shape imperfect, but its warmth filled the air. The cook sliced it carefully, laying each piece beside the broth. A simple meal, but a meal nonetheless, a way to greet the day with a measure of strength. Outside, the sky lightened. The sound of a distant rooster carried on the wind. A dog barked in the yard. The world beyond the tavern's walls began to stir, its rhythm returning. Yet inside, time felt slower, as if the tavern itself held its breath between night and day. A merchant arrived, his cloak travel-stained, his eyes lined with the weariness of the road. He set his pack down heavily, stretching his arms with a quiet sigh. The innkeeper offered him bread and broth without a word. Here, the traveller found a brief respite, a place to gather himself before the journey continued. In a corner, a young woman sat with her child. The boy, his hair tousled from sleep, leaned against her, his eyes half closed. She fed him small bites of bread, each one an act of care. Her own meal waited, but her hands moved first to him, always to him. The cook watched from the doorway, her own memories stirring, the child's hunger, a mother's love. Some things never changed. The innkeeper moved from table to table, collecting the remnants of the night before. A few scattered crumbs, a mug left behind, a worn cloth folded and set aside. His steps were measured, his gaze quiet. Every mark on the table, every dent in the floorboards told a story, some long forgotten, others still unfolding. Outside, the light grew stronger. The sky shifted from grey to soft gold. Birds began to call from the trees. The cook stoked the hearth, adding a few sticks of wood, coaxing the embers into a small flame. The fire caught slowly, then with a gentle rush, its warmth spreading through the room. A small comfort against the morning chill. The first proper meal of the day was underway. Oats thickened with milk, a few slices of dried fruit if they were lucky. The cook moved carefully, ladling portions into bowls, her mind already on the chores ahead. There would be more bread to bake, more stew to prepare, more herbs to dry for the evening meal. The tavern's hum began again. The traveller asked about the road to the next village, his voice low and steady. The innkeeper answered patiently, describing the turn near the old oak, the small bridge that creaked in the rain, each direction given with the care of someone who knew the land well. The cook caught snippets of conversation, talk of the harvest, of a neighbour's illness, of a calf born in the night. News carried on the wind, shared over bread and broth, each detail a small thread in the tapestry of the tavern's life. Near the hearth, the fire burned brighter now, its warmth spreading through the room. The cook felt the ache in her hands ease a little. She looked around the tavern, at the worn tables, the rough benches, the marks of years gone by, each scar, each stain, a memory of meals served, of laughter shared, of tears shed. Here, in this place of wood and stone, of bread and ale, life continued. Each meal a small comfort, each mug a reminder that, even in the hardest times, there was warmth to be found. The innkeeper paused near the doorway, his eyes on the road beyond. The world waited with all its troubles and joys, but for now, within these walls there was a measure of peace. The cook lifted her ladle, filling another bowl, her movements steady and sure. The innkeeper moved to the hearth, adding another log, his hands practiced, his mind calm. The tavern breathed in the dawn, its walls holding the promise of another day. A day of meals shared, of stories told, of small kindnesses offered and received. And so the tavern waited, its hearth glowing, its tables ready. A place where every traveller, every labourer, every soul who entered found a moment of rest. A place where food was more than nourishment. It was a bridge, a comfort, a reminder that in a world that could be hard and unkind, there was still a place for warmth and welcome. As the day stretched into late morning, the tavern settled into its steady rhythm. The air was filled with the gentle murmur of conversation, the scrape of wooden bowls, and the soft clink of mugs set down on worn tables. Each sound carried the weight of countless days before, each moment folding into the tapestry of this place. The cook worked near the hearth, tending a pot of stew that had begun to simmer. Its scent, rich with herbs and the promise of warmth, rose in slow, comforting waves. She stirred it thoughtfully, her eyes half closed in concentration. A handful of lentils, a slice of root vegetable, perhaps a scrap of meat if the market had been kind. She knew how to stretch every bit of food, to turn the simplest ingredients into something that fed not just the stomach but the spirit. At one table, a pair of travellers shared a quiet meal. Their clothes marked them as men of the road. Their eyes marked them as men of experience. They spoke little, each bite of bread and sip of ale a small ritual of trust. One reached for the bread, tearing it in two and offering half to the other. No words were needed. The gesture itself was enough. Near the window, a merchant sat with his ledger open, his quill scratching in slow, deliberate strokes. He paused now and then to sip from a chipped mug, his eyes distant, his mind on numbers and promises. The bread beside him had gone cold, but he didn't seem to notice. For him, the tavern was a place of pause, a small island between the chaos of trade and the uncertainty of the road. The innkeeper moved quietly among the patrons, his steps sure, his eyes always watching. He noted the weariness in the farmer's shoulders, the worry in the mother's eyes, the restlessness in the traveller's fingers. A nod here, a small word there, each one a reminder that in this place no one was truly alone. The cook ladled out the stew, each serving a small act of care. She passed the bowls to the innkeeper, who carried them to waiting hands. The stew's warmth filled the tavern, its scent mingling with the smoke from the hearth, the sharp tang of ale and the faint sweetness of dried herbs. For a moment the tavern felt like the heart of the world, its beat steady and strong. At the bar, a man leaned heavily on his elbows, his eyes fixed on the mug before him. He traced the rim with a calloused finger, his mind lost in the past. The innkeeper watched him for a moment, then poured another small measure of ale, setting it down with quiet understanding. No questions, no judgment, just a simple offering in a place that understood the weight of a man's burdens. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the road. Travellers passed, some pausing at the tavern's door to catch the scent of stew, to feel the promise of warmth. Others hurried on, their steps driven by errands and obligations. But for those who entered, the tavern offered a pause, a breath, a reminder that even in the midst of duty, there was still space for rest. Near the hearth, the cook added another handful of herbs to the pot. The green leaves wilted quickly, their scent rising to mingle with the rich broth. She smiled faintly, the lines at the corners of her eyes softening. Each pot of stew was a story of fields and markets, of weathered hands and quiet hopes. A story told not in words, but in each careful stirring of the pot. At the far table, an old man sat with a small loaf of bread, its crust dark and cracked. He broke it slowly, each piece a memory. His hands trembled, but his eyes were steady, watching the fire as if it held the answers to every question. The innkeeper paused beside him, his presence a silent comfort. In the tavern, even silence was shared. As the day moved on, the cook prepared for the next meal. She checked the larder, her eyes scanning the shelves. A few onions, a handful of carrots, a precious wedge of cheese. She knew how to make a feast from scraps, how to turn the leanest times into meals that still felt like home. Her hands worked with practiced grace, each movement a quiet prayer. The innkeeper refilled mugs and smoothed the worn tablecloths. His mind drifted to the road beyond the door, to the travellers who would come, seeking warmth and welcome. Each one would bring a story, a burden, a hope. And in the tavern, each one would find a place, a seat, a bowl of stew, a moment to breathe. In this place of wood and stone, of hearth and table, the day unfolded gently. The air carried the scents of herbs and bread, the sounds of laughter and quiet conversation. And in every corner, in every small act of care, the tavern whispered its promise, that no one who entered would leave unchanged. But here, in this small sanctuary, food was more than nourishment. It was a bond, a gift, a reminder that even in the hardest times, people needed each other. And so the tavern stood, its walls holding the warmth of countless meals, its hearth glowing softly. A place of simple things, a pot of stew, a loaf of bread, a mug of ale. But in those simple things lay the heart of life itself, a reminder that in the end it was not just food that sustained, but the quiet grace of sharing it together. The sun reached its highest point, casting light through the small, uneven windows of the tavern. Dust motes drifted lazily in the warm air, catching the sun's rays like tiny sparks. The room hummed with quiet conversation, the steady rhythm of spoons scraping bowls, and the occasional creak of a chair shifting under a weary patron. The cook stood near the hearth, her hands busy with a small wheel of cheese. She sliced it carefully, each piece thin and even, arranging them on a worn wooden board. Beside the cheese, she placed a handful of dark bread, its crust flecked with flour. A simple offering, but one that carried the weight of countless days just like this one. At a table near the centre, a man shared a quiet meal with his young daughter. Her small hands gripped the wooden spoon tightly, eyes bright with curiosity. She dipped the spoon into the stew, tasting each bite with the solemn focus of a child learning the world one flavour at a time. The man watched her, his eyes soft, his hands steady as he guided her through the meal. It wasn't just food. It was a lesson, a memory being made in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Near the hearth, the old dog shifted in his sleep, his tail thumping against the floorboards. He lifted his head briefly, one eye half open, before settling back into dreams. His presence was a comfort, a living reminder that even in a world that demanded so much, some things remained constant. The innkeeper moved with quiet efficiency, his hands gathering empty bowls, his eyes scanning the room for needs unspoken. He refilled mugs and offered small smiles, each one a gentle assurance that here at least the world could wait. In a place that bore witness to the weariness of travellers and the burdens of farmers, his small kindnesses wove a thread of belonging through the day. In the kitchen, the cook worked on a new pot of broth, her fingers deft with the bundle of the herbs she tied together. She dropped the bundle into the pot, watching as it sank and the scent began to rise, a warm, earthy aroma that promised comfort in every sip. She stirred the pot slowly, her mind drifting to the faces she'd served, the stories they carried, the laughter and tears they'd left behind like footprints on the floor. At the back of the tavern, a young couple sat with heads close together. They shared a piece of bread, each bite a small, tender promise. Their eyes spoke of plans, of dreams whispered in the quiet hours between work and sleep. The tavern held their secrets close, a silent witness to the beginning of a story that would unfold in days and years to come. The sun moved across the sky, and the light shifted with it, painting the wooden walls in shades of gold and amber. Shadows stretched and softened, the air warm with the mingled scents of food and wood smoke. The day carried on, each hour marked by the rhythm of the kitchen and the gentle rise and fall of voices. Near the door, a farmer leaned against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. Dirt still clung to his boots, his shirt marked with sweat from the fields. He He watched the room with tired eyes, seeing in its small comforts the promise of rest after a long day. The innkeeper passed him a mug of ale without a word, a small nod of understanding passing between them. Here, a man's labours found their reward in a shared drink and the simple warmth of a place that welcomed all. The cook glanced out the window, watching the sky shift toward the softer hues of afternoon. She checked the bread cooling on the shelf, its crust crisp and dark, its scent a quiet reassurance that tomorrow's meals were already half prepared. Each loaf, each bowl, each mug filled was a small victory against the uncertainty that waited beyond the tavern walls. At a corner table, a group of labourers shared a meal, their voices low but steady. They spoke of work and wages, of families waiting at home, of the weather and the price of grain. Between them, a single candle flickered, its light catching the lines on their faces, the marks of days spent in sun and rain and soil. Their laughter rose occasionally, brief and bright, before settling back into the steady hum of conversation. The innkeeper paused at the hearth, adding a few sticks of wood, coaxing the flames back to life. The fire responded with a soft crackle, its warmth spreading through the room. The cook brought another bowl of stew to a waiting patron, her steps careful, her eyes kind. In that small gesture, the tavern's promise lived on, a promise that no matter how hard the world pressed in, there would always be a place to rest, a meal to share, a fire to warm cold hands. Outside, the world continued. The road carried travellers toward distant places. Fields stretched toward the horizon, their crops bending in the breeze. But inside the tavern, time moved at its own pace, slow, deliberate, wrapped in the quiet comfort of shared meals and simple kindness. In this place of worn wood and gentle light, food was more than sustenance. It was a reminder of the strength found in community, of the hope carried in each small act of care. And as the day turned toward evening once more, the tavern waited, its hearth steady, its tables ready, its doors open to all who sought its gentle refuge. As the afternoon light softened into early evening, the tavern's glow deepened. Candles flickered on tables, their flames small but steady, casting gentle shadows on the wooden walls. Each flame carried its own quiet presence, a reminder that even in the gathering dark, warmth and comfort could be found. The cook moved steadily through the kitchen, her hands busy with a fresh loaf of bread. The crust was dark and rough, its scent strong and warm. She sliced it carefully, each piece a gift of simple sustenance. Beside the bread, she set out small dishes of soft cheese, its edges curled from the day's air but still rich with flavour. At one table, the merchant leaned forward, his elbows resting on the worn surface. His fingers toyed with the handle of his mug as he listened to a travelling companion speak of distant markets and the promise of trade. Their words were quiet, threaded with the cautious optimism of men who knew both profit and loss. Between them sat a small plate of dried fruit, its sweetness a welcome counterpoint to the day's worries. The innkeeper moved among the tables, his steps sure and unhurried. He carried mugs and bowls with practiced grace, his eyes always alert to the small needs of his patrons. A refill here, a question there. A conversation started or ended with a quiet nod. His presence was like the hearth's glow, steady, warm, unassuming. Near the hearth, a mother and her son shared a bowl of stew. The boy's eyes were wide as he listened to his mother's stories of fields and neighbours, of the dog that had chased the chickens and the goat that had escaped its pen, each tale woven with laughter, with the rhythm of lives lived close to the earth. The boy dipped his spoon into the stew, his small hand careful, his face intent, a moment of learning, of sharing, of belonging. At a corner table, a man with a lute tuned its strings, his fingers nimble and sure. He plucked a soft melody, the notes falling like rain on the quiet room. Some patrons turned their heads to listen, a small smile lifting tired faces. Music, like food, carried its own kind of comfort, its own quiet promise that the night would not pass unnoticed. The cook checked the hearth, adding a small stick of wood to the coals. The flames caught slowly, a soft sigh of heat and light. She turned to her pot of stew, giving it a gentle stir, her movements slow and careful. Each ingredient had its place, each herb its purpose. In her hands, the day's labours came together in a meal that promised more than nourishment. it offered a sense of home. Outside, the sky deepened, its colours shifting from gold to soft grey. The road beyond the tavern's door carried the distant sounds of carts and hooves, of travellers making their way toward home or away from it. Each one carried their own story, their own burdens. But here, within these walls, the world felt smaller, more manageable, a place where worries could be set down, even if only for a little while. At the bar, the innkeeper wiped a mug clean, his eyes thoughtful. He watched the room with quiet pride, seeing not just the patrons but the lives they carried. A farmer with dirt still under his nails, a traveller with a tired horse waiting outside, a child with laughter in his eyes, each one drawn here by the promise of a meal, a seat by the fire, a moment of warmth in the dark. The cook brought another loaf of bread from the kitchen, its crust still crackling with heat. She set it down on the bar, the smell rising like a blessing. The innkeeper cut it carefully, his hands sure, his eyes warm. Each slice shared with a smile, a word of welcome, a quiet assurance that here at least there was enough to go around. In the shadows near the window a man dozed, his head resting on folded arms. His mug sat half empty beside him, a few crumbs of bread marking the place where he'd finished his meal. The innkeeper paused beside him, checking the steady rise and fall of his breath. A small kindness, a quiet respect for the burdens that sleep might momentarily ease. The lute player's music rose and fell, a gentle rhythm that wrapped the room in its embrace. Patrons leaned back in their chairs, their eyes half closed, the day's worries softened by the melody and the warmth of shared bread and stew. The cook watched from the kitchen doorway, her hands folded, a small smile on her face. This, she thought, was what made the day's labours worthwhile. The quiet hum of contentment, the slow unspooling of stories shared over food and fire. The tavern walls held the echoes of laughter and the low murmur of voices, the scents of herbs and hearth smoke, the warmth of bread fresh from the oven. In every corner, in every small gesture of care, the tavern kept its promise that here no one was truly alone, that within these walls every meal, every note of music, every shared smile was a thread in the tapestry of a life lived in community. As evening settled in, the tavern's glow brightened, each candle a small beacon against the gathering dark. The innkeeper moved among his patrons, the cook tended her pots, the lute player's song drifted like a blessing through the room, and in that gentle, enduring rhythm the tavern carried on, one meal at a time, one story at a time, one night at a time. The night deepened outside the tavern, shadows lengthening until the world beyond the door seemed to vanish into darkness. Within, the hearth's glow wrapped the room in a warm, gentle light. Candles burned low, their flames small but determined. Every flicker of light cast new patterns on the worn wooden walls, adding to the tavern's quiet tapestry of stories. The cook moved steadily from hearth to table, her steps sure even as the evening wore on. She checked the pot of stew, now thick and hearty, its surface broken by the occasional bubble that released a fragrant sigh. She ladled portions into waiting bowls, each one a gift of comfort. Her hands moved with practiced grace, each movement deliberate, each gesture a small act of care. At a table near the centre of the room, a group of labourers shared their evening meal. Their faces lined by the sun and wind, their hands rough from the day's work. They spoke of fields and fences, of livestock and market days, their voices low but steady, each word carrying the weight of long hours and hard-earned rest. Between them, the stew cooled slowly, its scent mingling with the smoke of the hearth. The innkeeper watched from behind the bar, his eyes on every corner of the room. He noted the laughter shared between two travellers at a table near the door, the quiet conversation of the merchant bent over his ledger, the soft hum of the lute player as he tested a new tune, each detail a thread in the tapestry of the tavern's life, each face a story waiting to be told. Near the hearth, a young woman cradled her child, her face lit by the fire's glow. The boy slept, his head nestled in the crook of her arm. She ate slowly, one hand always resting on his small back, as if to reassure herself that he was still there, still safe. Her eyes drifted to the window, the darkness beyond holding both promise and fear. But here, within these walls, she found a measure of peace. The cook paused beside her, offering a small smile and a fresh piece of bread. No words, just the quiet understanding that sometimes the simplest gesture carried the most meaning. The woman returned the smile, her eyes soft, her shoulders easing as she accepted the gift. In the corner, the lute player's song drifted on, a gentle melody that carried the room in its embrace. His fingers moved easily over the strings, each note a soft reminder of a world beyond the day's labours. Some patrons closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others listened with half smiles, memories stirring behind their eyes. The cook returned to the kitchen, her step steady, her mind on the next meal. She checked the small stores in the larder, counting the onions, the last of the cheese, the small bundle of herbs. Every bit mattered, every scrap accounted for. She knew how to make do, how to stretch a meal until it was enough, and in that quiet knowledge she found a kind of pride. The innkeeper moved through the room, collecting empty mugs, wiping down tables, sharing small words of comfort where needed. His presence was constant, a steady light in the shifting tide of travellers and stories. He paused at the hearth, adding a log to the fire, coaxing it to life once more. The flames caught slowly, sending a warm glow across the floorboards. Near the door, a traveller sat with his cloak wrapped tightly around his shoulders, his face shadowed, his eyes distant. He held a half-finished mug in his hands, turning it slowly as if seeking answers in its smooth surface. The innkeeper paused beside him, offering a quiet word, a small gesture of welcome. The man nodded, his eyes meeting the innkeeper's for a moment, the briefest connection in a world too often defined by distance. The night wore on, and the tavern settled into its familiar rhythm. The lute's music softened, its notes lingering in the air like a benediction. The cook rested her hands on the edge of the hearth, watching the flames dance. Her mind drifted to mornings yet to come, to bread yet to bake, to meals yet to be shared. Each day a promise, each meal a quiet celebration of resilience. The innkeeper moved to the window, his gaze on the darkness beyond. The road stretched out into the night, carrying its travellers toward distant places. But here, within these walls, the night held its own kind of peace. A peace found in the simple act of sharing a meal, a song, a moment of rest. The tavern, with its worn tables and warm hearth, its scent of herbs and bread, its quiet hum of voices, held steady against the night. A place where food was more than sustenance, where every bowl of stew, every slice of bread carried the weight of hope and the comfort of belonging. In this gentle rhythm, the tavern carried on, one meal at a time, one story at a time, one night at a time. The night deepened and settled around the tavern like a comforting cloak. The candles burned lower now, their flames dancing softly in the dimming light. Each flicker of the hearth cast long shadows on the walls, painting the familiar room in a warm, living tapestry. The cook moved quietly near the fire, her hands steady as she prepared one last serving of stew. She stirred it gently, the herbs and broth mingling into a final offering for the evening. The pot was nearly empty now, its contents a testament to the day's shared stories and quiet connections. She set the bowl down on the bar with a small nod to the innkeeper, her eyes reflecting the glow of the dying embers. At the far table, a group of farmers shared a last piece of bread, their voices low, their laughter tinged with the soft weariness of a day well spent. One of them leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight, his eyes half closed as he savoured the warmth of the hearth and the comfort of companionship. The others nodded in agreement, each finding a measure of peace in the simple sharing of food and fire. Near the window, a lone traveller sat with his mug empty, his eyes on the road beyond the glass. The darkness stretched out before him, a quiet promise of miles yet to go. But here, in this moment, he found a pause, a gentle breath between the past and whatever lay ahead. The innkeeper refilled his mug with a silent nod, and the man accepted it gratefully, his hands warming around its familiar shape. The lute player set down his instrument, the last notes of his song fading into the night. He stretched his fingers, a small, satisfied smile crossing his face. His music had been a gift to the room, a thread of comfort woven through the evening's hours. He leaned back, letting the quiet settle in his bones. The cook wiped her hands on her apron, her thoughts drifting to tomorrow's tasks, the bread to be kneaded, the herbs to be gathered, the stew to be started anew. Each day carried its own quiet rituals, its own rhythms of care and provision. And in those small, steady acts, she found a purpose that gave shape to each dawn. The innkeeper moved among his guests, collecting empty mugs, sharing small farewells. His steps were slow but sure, each one a quiet affirmation of the tavern's promise. That here, in this place of worn wood and glowing hearth, no one was truly alone. The walls held the warmth of countless meals, the echo of voices lifted in laughter and in sorrow, the silent strength of a community bound by the simple grace of shared food. Outside, the night air was cool and still. The road lay quiet under a sky thick with stars, but inside the tavern glowed with the last of the fire's warmth, the scents of bread and herbs lingering like a memory, a place of refuge, of comfort, of stories shared over humble meals. As the last candle guttered low, the cook and the innkeeper shared a brief glance, a small nod that spoke of days past and days to come. The room fell silent, save for the soft sigh of the hearth and the gentle creak of settling wood. In that silence lay the heart of the tavern's promise, that food was more than sustenance. It was hope, connection, and the enduring reminder that in every meal shared, people found not just warmth, but each other. And so the tavern rested, its walls holding the quiet strength of countless evenings, a place where bread and stew became more than mere food, a place where every traveller, every labourer, every soul found a home, if only for a while. And in that simple, enduring truth, the tavern's light would carry on, one meal at a time, one story at a time, one night at a time.